Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Janet Gillow, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School here at Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome to Open Classroom. For those of you joining on the Zoom webinar, you are muted. We cannot see or hear you, and we can't call on raised hands, but the chat feature is enabled, and we've loved so far as many people have already chatted in their greetings. We want you to keep doing that through the program, as that's how you're going to be able to add comments and questions as we go. Want to welcome anybody joining us on the YouTube platform. Unfortunately, we are not able to moderate questions on YouTube. So I want to thank and acknowledge my friend and co-host, Cynthia Williams, the Brown School's Assistant Dean for Community Partnerships. She's here helping me with today's program and will also help represent your voice in the conversation as we go. Before we get started, I just want to let you know some of the things that we have coming up. Everything on Open Classroom is free and open to absolutely all who are interested. So later on this week, Thursday, October 7th, Alefta Hare Redcorn is delivering a program called Peri in Perpetuity, Peeling Back the Layers of Agricultural Policy in a Prayerful Way. This is part of the 2021 Indigenous Knowledge and Sustainability Conference, and our own Catherine M. Booter Center is a sponsor of that event, so we're working with them on that lecture, which is one of many in that Indigenous Knowledge Conference. Then 1 week from today, a little bit earlier in the day, we'll be on with Dr. Benjamin Kudu. He's going to be joining us from the Ivory Coast, and he'll be delivering a talk on contributions to elimination of infectious diseases in West Africa. This is part of the Africa Speaks series. So just a little bit of a sense of the types of programs we have, but there are dozens of things before the end of the year. We would love to have you come back for any and all that are of interest to you. So today's program, before we get started, just want to thank and acknowledge that this program is brought to you by the support of Catholic Charities of Greater St. Louis. We want to thank them for making this possible and especially welcome the members of their team who are part of our audience today. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Lorian Carter. Lorian has a decade of direct practice experience with adolescents, as well as program coordination and management experience in public school and healthcare settings. She is an associate professor of the practice here at the Brown School and a trainer and curriculum writer for Wyman Center's Teen Outreach Program. She brings true affection and great understanding to adolescents, and that is what makes her so good at her work. Please welcome Lorian Carter here to talk to us about what's going on in the teenage brain and why it matters.
Great, thank you so much, Janet. So as Janet mentioned, my name is Lorian Carter. I use she, her pronouns, and I do teach primarily in the social work side of the Brown School as an associate professor of practice. So as Janet mentioned, I have a lot of experience with teenagers. As a full-time faculty member, I only get to directly interact with a few at this stage in my career, but they really are my origin story. I started my career as a high school social worker and then spent 6 years coordinating a teen pregnancy clinic here in the St. Louis area. And so, you know, what I get to do now is share my passion for youth development with all of you who are also working with and maybe even living with teenagers. And again, you know, this idea that at the end of this webinar, you may not love teenagers as much as I do, but I'm hopeful that you will have a little bit of a better understanding of at least what's happening and how that plays out in their behaviors. So this, this talk on adolescent brain development, it's really important that I give a little note here that I do not have a degree in neuroscience. I am going to make this presentation relatively medical jargon free. My goal with this is that those of you who, again, live and or work with teenagers who are also non-neuroscientists will be able to have some language around what's going on in the teenage brain. So just wanted to kind of get that out there that, you know, I don't represent a neuroscience perspective, but I started pulling research and resources together many years ago and have continued to really be fascinated by the adolescent brain research that is coming out, because I really do think it helps explain so much of what we see in the behaviors of the teenagers that we encounter. So I could probably do this entire presentation in memes. I won't, but I probably could. And I put this out here as part of my opening to say that many of you may have had these experiences with teenagers where, you're having a kind of a good morning with a teenager and you just want to let that ride because, as soon as you say any one thing, it could really spin in another direction. Sometimes even speaking to a teenager is perceived as hostility from that teenager. And sometimes we're really tempted to try to use all the slang that they use in an effort to connect. And so again, while I won't use all of the memes that are out there in the world, I do think there's a little bit of truth in these, right? And so as we're talking about the concepts around adolescent brain development, what's actually happening in that brain, again, some of that knowledge that we're going to gain today is driving what we see in these memes. So here's our agenda. So we're going to start by doing a little reflection on your own memories from your teenage years. We'll spend some time talking about the domains of adolescent development, mostly the ones that are connected to adolescent brain development. And then we'll do kind of a deep dive into adolescent brain development and talk some about how traumatic experiences actually impact brain development and what that might look like behaviorally for the teenagers that you live and or work with. And sort of embedded throughout the entire presentation, we'll talk about strategies that can really help us understand and potentially even interact differently with the teenagers that are in our schools, on our caseloads, in our homes, and on our lives. So the first way we're going to gain some of that knowledge is by taking you back a little bit. So what I'm going to ask you to do for this is take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so. Remember, we can't see you on the webinar, so no one will know if your eyes are open or closed. But if you're in a setting that is maybe has some distractions, you might find that closing your eyes will be really helpful for this. And as you're taking those deep breaths, I'm going to ask you to go back in time. Think back to when you were in 9th grade in the United States, typically maybe 13 or 14 years old, sort of on the cusp between early adolescence and mid-adolescence. And I'm going to describe some scenarios. And as I do that, I want you to think about what you remember that might be similar to these scenarios, or maybe someone you know, maybe other siblings or cousins or friends who had some of these experiences. And just do some mental reflection for yourself about what that time in your life was like. I will make a note that if at any time any of the scenarios are activating or triggering for you, please take care of yourself. Physically, mentally step away from the scenario. Use any kind of regulation activity, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, counting to 10, and then re-engage or don't as you feel like you can during this guided imagery. It is absolutely okay to say that the best way for me to not get triggered is to not step back into that time in my life. And I 100% appreciate that perspective. But if you're able, take those deep breaths and think about typical interactions that you may have had when you were 13 or 14 with adults in your family. Was at least one parent or caregiver home when you left for school in the morning or when you arrived home in the afternoon? Do you remember a parent or caregiver asking about your day and listening to your answer? Do you remember a parent or caregiver having important conversations with you? Maybe conversations about substance use, sexual behaviors, curfew rules, or other topics. How were rules and expectations set in your family? Did you get to participate in making the rules and determining the consequences? I'm now going to ask you to think about a typical school day when you were in 9th grade. Did school feel like a safe place for you? Did you arrive early for morning band practice or to meet with the yearbook staff? What do you remember about how you felt about school? Were you looking forward to a class in particular? Was it because of the teacher or the content? If there were teachers that you liked, what did you like about those teachers? Was it the way they interacted with you? Was it the fact that they didn't notice if you were gossiping in the back of the room? Were there teachers that you didn't like? And what was that like? What was that about? What were the behaviors they did or the ways they engaged with you that didn't really work for you? Did you spend any time in the principal's office? Or the guidance counselor's office? Or the school social worker's office? Who do you remember talking to at school? Thinking about adults? We'll talk a little bit about who you might have talked to as friends here in a minute. Continuing on this adults theme, think about your typical interaction with adults other than your family members and school teachers or coaches. Were you involved in extracurricular clubs or enrichment activities? Organizations like Boy Scouts, 4-H, maybe a school or club athletic team, maybe a church, synagogue, or mosque youth group. Maybe you took competitive cheer or music or dance lessons. What were the interactions with adults in those programs like? How did those adults in those extracurriculars, enrichment organizations, how did those interactions either amplify the way other people were reacting and interacting with you? Was it similar to how your parents and caregivers and teachers interacted with you? Or was it significantly different? And if it was different, was it better or worse qualitatively? And what do you base that on? I'm going to ask you now to think about typical interactions with your peers and your friends. Were you popular? Were you bullied? Were you a leader in your friend group? What kind of activities do you remember doing with your friends? Did you wander through the mall? Have friends over at your house? Hang out at another friend's house? I'm going to give you some time with this friends piece, because for many adolescents, and probably what you remember from your own adolescence, is there was a lot about peers and friends. You may have had great relationships with friends who were super helpful and positive influences in your life, but it could have also been the opposite. Do you remember being either overtly pressured or maybe just subtly encouraged to engage in behaviors that you probably wouldn't have alone? Risky behaviors like drinking, driving recklessly, shoplifting. Maybe you were the instigator, and you can think back to times when you may be subtly encouraged or even overtly pressured friends to come along with you to engage in some kind of vandalism or other delinquency behavior. Did you and your friends get in trouble for things like skipping school, missing curfew, hanging out in crowds in communities that had ordinances against teenagers hanging out in crowds in the afternoons and evenings. If you did get into some trouble, what was the outcome of that? Were you given sort of a slap on the wrist and a don't do that again? Or did you find yourself involved with law enforcement? At any point when you did some stupid things as a teenager, do you remember an adult saying to you, "What were you thinking? You knew better"? Do you remember how you responded to that? So finally, I'm going to ask you to think about how different your life is now as an adult from when you were 13 or 14. Did any of the behaviors that you engaged in as a teenager lead to opportunities for you as an adult? So maybe that athletic team that you were part of in high school led to a college athletic scholarship. Maybe you still play the piano today because of those music lessons that your mother made you take. I want you now to think about that transition from adolescence into early adulthood. What do you remember about that? Can you think about a turning point? Is there a turning point that you can remember as being really significant in your ability to make healthy decisions for yourself? Do you remember the first independent decision you made? What was it? What do you remember feeling about that opportunity to make an independent decision? Have you had any conversations with your parents and caregivers about what your teenage years were like for them? And if so, what did they say? If not, what do you think they would say? If you haven't had a conversation like that with a parent or caregiver, I encourage you to do that if you can later today. What was it like for you trying to parent me as a teenager? How did your experiences as a teenager shape the person that you are today? How did your experiences as a teenager shape the way you are or want to parent your teenagers if you identify as someone who is parenting a teenager or will be parenting a teenager? If you identify as a professional who works with teenagers, how did your teenage experiences influence your decisions and your daily interactions with your teen clients? I'm going to invite you to take a couple more deep breaths. Open your eyes if you've had them closed. Return to today, where you are a fully grown adult with your teen years in your rearview mirror, either your very recent rearview mirror or maybe a distant rearview mirror, but you are now kind of back into being this grown person. And as you're returning to your grown self, I invite you to think of one word that best describes what this guided imagery activity was like for you, but please don't put it in the chat just yet. This is just kind of closing out this guided imagery and a chance to think about a word that describes what it was like to do this. Okay. So
Lauren, we don't have presenter view at this point.
Okay, one second. Let's try this again. What do you see?
A shape.
It's working the right way now?
Yes. Yep. Perfect.
Excellent. Great. This reflection we're going to do is a Zoom waterfall. So what that is everyone's going to type that one word that describes how they felt during that guided imagery activity, but don't hit enter right away. I'm going to give folks a few minutes or a few seconds to get that into the chat. And when I say okay, everyone will hit enter at the same time, and we will get just a waterfall and a cascade of answers all at once. And this is just a really fun way to kind of crowdsource some common themes that came out of this activity without asking all 214 of you to respond verbally to this, which we can't do because it's a webinar. So take a minute or so to type that word into the chat and then hold. All right, go ahead and hit enter and we should see just a waterfall. Here it is. There are now 75 answers showing up in the chat, 84, 85 answers. We're past 90 answers here. Whew, so many ideas here. All the feels. So when folks who couldn't just pick one, right? And lots of really different ideas here, right? Some folks felt really anxious by that. Some were uncomfortable by that. Some thought it was great. It felt wonderful to be able to go back in time, proud maybe of who you are as an adult now. So I think this is a really important activity to kind of start our day, because the rest of what we're going to be talking about are those, you know, 9th grade, 13, 14-year-olds, right? Anywhere along that adolescent continuum and what they're experiencing now. And I think sometimes as adults, we don't remember what it was like to be a teenager. We don't remember what it was like to have very little control over many things about our lives, including our brain development, right? It was not within any of our cognitive control to say, I will choose to use a more mature prefrontal cortex when I'm making this decision. And yet as adults, when we have that fully developed adult brain, we can't remember what it was like to not have it. And so we are speaking from and thinking from and reflecting from our adult brain when we're interacting with teenagers who don't yet have an adult brain. And their adolescent brain is doing the best it can. And yet it really is very, very different from the way that we react and respond to situations. And so I think by just taking a few minutes to kind of go back a bit, it allows you to have a little bit more empathy for what that experience was like for you, and maybe even what it might be like for the teenagers that you work with or live with. So sort of my key take-home message here is that teenagers are not big kids and they're not little adults. And that this whole phase of adolescence is this period of really unique growth and development. And when we treat them like they're big kids or small adults, we miss out on actually providing them with what they need. We treat them like they are already grown, but their brains aren't. Or we treat them like they are still little kids without the ability to start to think about independent decision-making. And either one of those is not really aligned with where they are. So we really want to understand what they need, what is happening for them in adolescence, so that we can design our interactions and our interventions to be developmentally appropriate. So I'm going to start with a reframe on adolescent brain development. And this comes from an actual neuroscientist who studies a lot of brain development. And I just pulled this quote out because, a couple quotes, because I just think it's not the way we typically think about teenage brains. So thinking about teenagers as exquisitively sensitive, highly adaptable creatures, wired almost perfectly for the job of moving from the safety of home into the complicated world outside. In scientific terms, they are quite possibly the most fully, crucially adaptive human beings around. when was the last time you encountered a teenager and said, wow, that kid is the most fully adaptive human around? And much of the way that we think about adolescent brain development is it's a brain under construction. And that's accurate, but it can seem a little bit like victim blaming, right? It can seem a little bit like, what they're victims of is the biological and neurological transition period that they're in, but they can't really willfully choose their brain development. And so when we talk about it being under construction, it's sort of like it isn't done yet. And yet there are some things about the adolescent brain that, again, make them really prepared for exactly the things we need them to do. So we'll be talking about that as the rest of our presentation, but I want you to keep this in your mind. And you'll be able to access the slides from this presentation on the landing page for open classrooms. But if you want to screen grab this, of all the things I'm talking about today, screen grab this strengths-based perspective on adolescent brain development and carry it with you throughout the rest of the day and your interactions with teenagers. So brain development is not happening in a vacuum. It's actually happening in the context of other domains of adolescent development. And this presentation is focused specifically on brain development, so I won't go into the physical changes, psychological, social, or moral changes of adolescent development domains, but I am going to talk a little bit about cognitive development because cognition and brain development go hand in hand. And so understanding some of the cognitive shifts that are happening during adolescence is really helpful to think about adolescent brain development. So there's a cognitive development element called egocentric thinking. So egocentric thinking is this thinking that many adolescents have, that they are unique from everyone else. No one else is capable of understanding them and their feelings. You will often hear them say things like, you just don't get it. You don't understand. Right. They also have, as part of this process, this idea of an imaginary audience. So not only does no one understand what it's like to be them, they really do think everyone is watching them all the time. They feel like they're on a stage and everyone knows when they do something silly or dumb or make a mistake, that everyone saw that. And it is so connected for them in terms of, if it's all about me, I have to be perfect all the time. Everyone is watching me. Any mistake I make is being noticed by my teachers, by my parents, by my friends. That isn't true, especially in terms of peer interactions, because their peers are also busy thinking about themselves. They haven't even noticed what's happened, right? And then there also is this egocentric thinking that is about invulnerability. That's not going to happen to me. I am smarter than that. That won't happen to me. I don't have to worry about that. That advice is for someone else, right? Because I am in charge of everything about my own being. So that's one piece of cognitive development. The other piece is this idea of abstract thinking. So abstract thinking is the cognitive ability to imagine possible and impossible outcomes, to consider different outcomes for a single choice. We differentiate this from concrete thinking in that concrete thinkers typically need to have experienced something to believe it would happen. So this, this example that's on the slide here, a concrete thinker would say to a parent who says, take your asthma inhaler with you. You're going to get sick if you miss your asthma inhaler. And the concrete thinker says, you know what, I missed it twice. Nothing bad happened to me, so I don't think I need it, right? That's not going to happen. I'm not really going to get sick. But we see this shift into abstract thinking in mid-adolescence, where now a teenager could take that same set of advice from a caregiver, take your inhaler with you, and they can think about it differently. They can say, I missed my inhaler a couple times, but nothing bad happened. That might be because I wasn't doing any exercise. The weather was really nice. It wasn't a time when I typically have asthma attacks. I think I'm probably going to need to hang on to my inhaler because I might need it again in the future, right? They can be future oriented without having had to experience something in order to think about what might happen. So in some ways, it's this idea of a choose your own adventure, right? Abstract thinking, kids who have abstract thinking can think about 4 or 5 different possible consequences or outcomes from a single decision. And that's really great, right? The ability to problem solve in creative ways are going to serve them really well throughout life. All of us as adults know that there are many situations where we are presented with a plethora of options, and we really do have to think down the road about the consequence of those options. And sometimes it's down the road and around the corner. And concrete thinkers are really bad at seeing around the corner, but abstract thinkers can do that. They can start to imagine this might happen or this might happen. Right? And so that hypothetical deductive reasoning is a really, really great thing to encourage in the adolescents that we live and work with. But I want to make a really important point here that sometimes the presence of abstract thinking also leads to significant anxiety. So what this might look like for an adolescent who is starting to develop abstract thinking is now, because they can imagine things happening that haven't actually happened, they can start thinking about worst case scenarios. So they may be lying in bed awake at night, worrying about, if there were a fire at our house, what would I save? Who would come get me? Would I be able to take my dog? Would I, where would we live after a fire at our house? And they don't have to have had a friend who's had a fire at their house. It's just something that sort of pops in their brain, and they start to think about what they would do. They can also think about, what would happen if my parents got divorced or someone died in a car wreck tonight? How would my life be different tomorrow? And so that being able to think about all the possible outcomes of a particular choice or a particular situation can be really anxiety provoking. And so to recognize that when young people start asking us questions like, what would you save if our house caught fire tonight? As an adult, typically our response is, don't worry about that. It isn't going to happen. We never had a fire. None of our friends have ever had a fire. It's very unlikely we're going to have a fire. Don't worry about it, right? That's typically what we do. And that's really unhelpful for an adolescent who is now kind of entering abstract thinking, because what it says to them is nobody has a plan for what's going to happen if our house burns down tonight. I'm the only one who can think about it, right? Because again, they still have some egocentric thinking there. I better think about all these things. I need to worry about these things because my parents aren't. My caregivers are minimizing this, right? So just to say that while we want to encourage abstract thinking, we also need to be prepared for what goes along with it, right? So I'm going to give you some pro tips here. So these are some ways to respond to adolescents who are kind of in this cognitive developmental phase in a way that's really developmentally appropriate. So when you see that egocentrism appearing and they say things like, you don't get it, no one understands what it's like to be me, it's easy for us to want to say something like, I was a teenager, I actually do get it, I just participated in this webinar where I learned all about it. And instead, what we might want to say is something like, you're right, I don't know what that's like for you. Tell me more about what you're going through. When we're working with a concrete thinker, give them opportunities to actually experience the closest proximity to something that might happen. So for example, a really developmentally appropriate intervention for a concrete thinker would be something like a simulator machine that simulates how the reflexes are impacted by driving under the influence. We obviously don't want kids to have to experience driving under the influence to realize that they can't control their car in the same ways they could if they were sober, but a simulation machine that shows them that it actually is not within their control to do. That's how a concrete thinker is going to think differently about that situation, because now they have had an experience that is much more tied to what would happen without having had it happen. So we just want to make sure that we're thinking about what are the ways that we're really embracing the ability for young people to move into abstract thinking, but also recognizing that when they're in concrete thinking, they can't see down and around the corner. Let's show them what it actually might be like. So when we see that what if, when that emerging abstract cognition happens, instead of saying, don't worry about it, our house is not going to burn down, explore what they're worried about, right? And instead of saying, don't worry about it, say things like, if our house were going to burn down, what would be important to you that I take? What would you take, right? Engage in a conversation and reassure them that no matter what happens, you're going to help them through it. Even if what they're worried about is really not that likely to happen. Instead of minimizing that, engage with it and help them see that, yeah, you are recognizing that they're starting to move into abstract thought. And, being able to think about the what ifs is a really important phase. It's a really important stage for them, even when the things that they're thinking about are anxiety provoking for them. So with those two pieces of cognitive development in mind, we're going to spend most of the rest of the time here really kind of thinking a little bit more deeply about what's happening in that teenage brain. And again, from my non-neuroscience perspective here, there are a variety of different neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, melatonin that are in fluctuating amounts in the teenage brain. So that is a way to kind of, again, in a developmentally appropriate kind of perspective, the mood swings, dopamine and serotonin are very involved in our mood and mood regulation. And for adolescents, again, this kind of bursts of either of those that they don't have a lot of control over ends up looking like really moody, right? Melatonin is also, it's one of the neurotransmitters that's involved in a sleep cycle. Many of us know more about this now because we take melatonin to help our bodies get into a natural sleep cycle. It's important to know that for teenagers, their circadian rhythms are shifting. And what that means is that they are not tired early in the evening. They are alert and awake much later than they used to be. And they are much more tired in the mornings. So even if you had kids who bounced out of bed at 7 in the morning on a Saturday when they were 6 and 7 years old, when they are 13 and 14, you won't be able to drag them out of bed at 10 on any day of the week. And at 2 or 3 in the morning, you're going to hear them wandering around the house and looking for something to eat. Right. The circadian rhythm shifting is it's again making sense of what they're doing. And in some ways, this is where our systems need to not be set up for us, but they need to actually be set up for young people. And so there have been school districts that have shifted their start times for their high school programs to align better with adolescent sleep cycles, because we know adolescents need between 9 and 10 hours of sleep a night. And so, if high schools can start later, they're more likely to be alert than when high schools start very early. And the early research that's coming back on those school districts that have piloted this is they have better attendance in their first hour classes. They have better test scores in their early morning classes as a result of, again, sort of like working with the adolescent brain, as opposed to trying to drag these adolescents with adolescent brains into kind of a model that has worked for adults in schools as opposed to what works for teenagers. So again, all of these hormones are doing things, all of these neurotransmitters are doing things, and they're impacting what we see behaviorally with kids. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about. And this is about how the adolescent brain is custom built in some ways. And so what we want to think about here is that brains like to create efficiencies. So imagine that you had to think through every step in a sequence for a task of daily living. So think about buttoning a shirt or tying your shoes. And when you first learned that skill, you had to be much more intentional and thoughtful about it. Now, it's just something that you do. And that is a result of an efficiency that your brain has created. Because brains like to be as efficient as possible. They like to not have to spend a lot of time thinking about the same thing over and over and over. And so we think of this as the neural pathways in the brain get created, used, and strong when there are opportunities to practice and try things. And then there are neural pathways that go unused when they don't have opportunities to try things. And so we really think of brains being custom built in that there are all these pathways, and what young people have exposure to and opportunities to do actually does drive how much those neural pathways get strengthened through a process that's called myelinization. And so again, that myelinization is a strong pathway in a brain that's like, I know what to do with this. I've done it a lot. I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to make sure that it's very easy for my brain to do this. And then there's these other things that, the medical term for this is the neural pathway to get pruned, where the brain has said, I experienced that once. Nobody ever came back to it. I don't think I need to keep it in in my brain. I don't need to pay that much attention to it right now. So I'm just going to kind of prune it out of my way of thinking. So what we really want is to make sure that the young people in our lives have opportunities for really strong pathways that will serve them well throughout their life. So there are a wide variety of things that promote myelinization. Writ large enrichment programs. So this can look like things like music lessons, dance, arts and culture. It can look like travel and learning a different language. It can look like spending time in nature. It can look like being part of a team. It can look like computer coding and robotics. All of these types of programs, create diverse opportunities for young people to try on skills, to practice those skills, and to then use those skills throughout their life. And you can imagine a kiddo who learns coding in middle school and high school is going to be in high demand as the rest of our world continues to be so dependent on technology. Right? So music and foreign languages and art and travel, all of those things are really important to building strong neural pathways. But for the adolescents that most of us as social workers work with, these young people are the least likely to have access to these things. They're the ones that need it the most, and they're the ones that are likely to have the least access to it. And that really does then have an impact on how their brains are formed as they move into adulthood. There are other things that also promote myelinization in the brain, things like opportunities to use critical thinking, problem-solving skills, social emotional learning, all of the strategies that are embedded in social emotional learning and in life skills, opportunities to be of service to others and to learn a new skill while they're doing that, formal programs like Youth Build and many, many others that are really focused on those positive adult interactions with young people. All of those help strengthen those neural pathways for teenagers. And again, for those of us who are in this space as social workers, it is often our role to be that advocate for opportunities for young people to engage in social emotional learning and critical thinking, highlighting the real value of life skills training and service learning approaches, and being those supportive adults, right? And again, we can't ensure that every young person has access to travel to a foreign country. We can be really thinking about what should every young person have access to, and it's the opportunities and the exposure to things that will continue to serve them well throughout their life, and they'll actually create those really strong neural pathways. So now we're going to talk about the actual process of adolescent brain development. So the brain develops from the back to the front. So at the very back of the brain is the amygdala. We think of this as the emotional brain. It's very emotion-centered. It reacts to stimuli. In the sort of the middle of that part of the brain is the nucleus accumbens. It is thought of as the reward and pleasure center of the brain. All the way at the front is what we call the prefrontal cortex. Sometimes we think of that as the logical brain. It's been called the CEO of the brain, right? It makes the big decisions, and it makes decisions that are around delayed gratification, the ability to see and consider perspectives of other people, thinking before acting. But again, because the brain develops from the back to the front, that prefrontal cortex is one of the last parts of the brain to develop. Brain development continues into mid-20s. So we think about tweens, those 11 and 12-year-olds being kind of at the beginning of adolescent brain development. That brain development can happen then throughout the next decade of their lives into their mid-20s before we see a fully formed prefrontal cortex. So in some ways, this process of development really makes evolutionary sense, right? Back in the day, we needed somebody to be hunter-gatherers, and young people who were using their reward-centric part of their brain were more likely to want to go out and kill the buffalo, right? They weren't thinking about, if I go after this buffalo and it turns around and charges me, what's the likelihood that I could run faster than the buffalo to get back to? They aren't thinking like that. They're like, buffalo, I am man, hear me roar, here I go. We needed that. right? We needed those folks. Again, it's back to that that comment around the adolescent brain is really, really highly adaptive for leaving the safety of home. The reward center of their brain is activated at the same time that now we may not need them to be hunter-gatherers, but we do need them to ask for help. We do need them to go to college. There's something inherently risky about leaving home and trying something new. We need them to be a little bit fearless, right? Or at least not 100% logical all of the time, because it means that they'll try new things and that they'll walk up to someone and greet them and say, I'd really like to learn about what you know how to do, because I think I might want to do that. That's inherently a little bit risky and vulnerable. And so again, the way that the brain has developed evolutionarily made sense. There are still some things about it that make sense now. And we also have a lot more things to worry about, right? We now have vehicles that they can drive too fast when the reward center of their brain is activated. We have these other very risky situations that we want young people to be, to not have to experience, right? We want them to not, have to have a negative experience of something when they weren't using their prefrontal cortex. So we can want all of those things for young people. Some of the things we've talked about earlier, right? Giving them opportunities to connect what might happen before it actually happens can really help with that. But a lot of this is just recognizing that we have to do the best we can to put structure in place that will mitigate the negative outcomes of those risks, because teenagers are wired during their adolescent years to take risks. So this is just, again, this is my one brain scan visual for you here. And this shows how the brain develops. The blue parts are the more mature networks in the brain. So you can see that between 5 and 12, there's a little bit of growth, but then between 12 and 20, there is a significant amount of growth. This is where we start to see that prefrontal cortex becoming the primary way that young people make decisions as they move into their 20s and into adulthood. So we think of amygdala thinking as eat, which I think is great because all of us who have teenagers in our homes know that they eat a lot. They are eating us out of house and home in more ways than just physically. They are actually using their amygdala to think, and EAT stands for emotion, then action, then thinking. As the brain develops, they start to think around prefrontal cortex, and we think of this as ETA. And I think, again, this is an easy way to remember it. It will eventually happen. We're not sure what the estimated time of arrival is, but it is later in adolescence. And that is where then emotion happens, but thinking is the next piece, and then actions happen. So over time, as young people strengthen their prefrontal cortex through all kinds of opportunities to practice thinking before acting, that's how we kind of help them begin to use that ETA as opposed to that EAT. So these are just all of the many, many things that the prefrontal cortex can do and does for us as adults. So it helps us organize thoughts. It helps with problem solving, considering consequences of behavior, considering the future, balancing short-term rewards and long-term goals, impulse control, delaying gratification, right? All of these things that just have to happen through adolescence. They don't wake up one day having shifted from their amygdala brain to their prefrontal cortex. It happens over time. Our job as supportive adults and or professionals who are working with teenagers is to give them as many opportunities as possible to practice using their prefrontal cortex. That is how that part of their brain will get strengthened. And again, the neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex will be there and available for them forever when we work with them during this phase of their life. So what we often see is that immature prefrontal cortex is drawn really heavily towards risk-taking. They overestimate the short-term rewards. They also have that egocentric invincibility, not me, it isn't going to happen to me. And so then they also have this really high importance of peers, right? And that's what's happening as part of their social development, is this differentiation from family with a focus then on peers, which again, we want to see with our young people as they move into independence from their families. But early on, they are making those decisions based on peer influence. For those of you during our guided imagery activity who remembered either being subtly encouraged or maybe even overtly pressured by a peer, they mattered a whole lot to us, right? And we wanted to do things that made us seem like we were in with the in crowd, right? And so that's what we see every time we want to say to a young person, you know better. What were you thinking? Really, this is what they were thinking. This is with what part of their brain they were thinking. So I also like to talk a little bit about this idea of hot and cold cognition. So hot cognition is affective arousal. The brain is actually hot. It's overstimulated, it's uncomfortable. And in those stages, when hot cognition is happening, emotion is likely to take over and make decisions, the emotional brain. Cold cognition is non-pressured. This is sort of like our ideal situation. The brain's comfortable, it's not stressed, it's not overwhelmed. This is the best time to practice logic and reasoning. So we want to think about opportunities to practice in cold thinking. So giving young people opportunities to practice thinking about how they would react or respond to a situation, it helps to strengthen their prefrontal cortex. And over time, it increases their ability to handle increased stress and the increase in their hot cognition, again, over time. What happens often with teenagers is we talk to them about a hypothetical situation, like what would you do if someone wanted to fight you? And in cold cognition, they would probably say something like, I wouldn't fight back. I don't really care about, somebody wanting to fight me. I'd tell an adult. But then when they're presented with that situation and there are a lot of friends around and there are no adults around, their brain is now starting to get overstimulated and stressed, and they find themselves now in a fight, right? And when we come pick them up from school and we say, didn't we just talk about this? Don't you remember we talked about this? They sort of just give us the shrug, right? And so it really is about what shifted in their brain. They shifted from the cold cognition, where their thinking could be in charge, to their hot cognition, where emotion takes over. So we want to recognize that hot and cold cognition happens for adults too. And I think this is important because some point, it feels like only teenagers behave in these ways, but there are plenty of adults who, when they get stressed, react from a place of hot cognition as well. And so this can be a really normalizing place to help a teenager understand that this is something they're going to need to be thoughtful about throughout their lives. It's not like once they have this adult brain that has a fully formed prefrontal cortex, they never need to think about hot cognition. We all, when our brains are under stress, cognition heats up. So here's an example again from working with teenagers. So we have a teenager in the program with supportive adults. They learn about the harmful effects of alcohol, and they make a pledge in this program to not drink while they're underage. And then the teen's walking home with some friends. There's no adults there. The peer says they have some beer. Teen was worried about how they're going to look in front of their friends if they say no. You can see we're kind of moving up the temperature gauge here. The peer says their older brother drinks and nothing bad ever happens to him. And the peer starts to really pressure that teenager. What do you think the teenager does? It's pretty likely that teenager is going to actually try that beer, right? Even though they just made a pledge to not drink while they're underage. And this is what we're going to do. What were you thinking? And when we do that, we actually need to stop, because what were you thinking should really be, with what part of your brain were you thinking? And it should be, what was the temperature of your cognition? And this just doesn't roll off the tongue very easily. But when teens engage in behaviors and choices that make us really want to scream, what were you thinking? We do want to take a step back with our adult brains and remember that they are wired for emotion first, and they are wired for brains to, as it gets more heated, and they don't have the skills that keep their brain from being overheated. They don't have the skills to kind of regulate themselves in the presence of peers, that they are going to make risky decisions. So in terms of what are the tips here, right? Some pro tips here. First of all, just stop asking, what were you thinking? Instead, have a conversation that says, tell me a little bit more about what went into that decision. Tell me a little bit more about, what were you thinking when this happened, right? What was your thought process, but not what were you thinking, but let's talk through this. How do you connect this pledge that you took to not use alcohol with then this decision to use alcohol? What happened between the pledge and the decision? Let's talk through that, right? And what I think of as a really important tip here is that we want to talk to teenagers about this, right? If adolescent brain development and hot and cold cognition are new concepts for most adults, they're really new for teenagers. Very few programs spend time teaching teenagers about their own brain development or about hot and cold cognition. More programs should, more supportive adults should, more parents should talk with their kids, because information and knowledge is power. It is one more tool in their toolkit. When something starts to happen, they can connect it to, oh my gosh, this is like this thing that my parent or my teacher or my guidance counselor talked to me about how emotion can really take over a brain. Now I know what is going on. Because when we say, what were you thinking? A lot of times the answer is, I don't know. I wasn't thinking. Right? And so we can change that narrative by helping them think through in advance, in cold cognition. This is what's going on. It happens in all of our brains. When our brains get stressed, we react and respond in some kinds of ways that may have different consequences than what we're willing to live with. So that happens for adults too. But let's talk a little bit more about it. So really, really, really giving young people information, because information can be power. So we have a lot more information now about the impact of trauma on brain development. So I think this is an important part of this webinar, because again, especially for those of you who are joining us as professionals, many of the young people that we work with have experienced trauma or traumatic events. And it's important for us to kind of recognize that it has an impact on the way that they behave. So trauma affects the developing brain in a lot of ways. What happens, and again, we talked about, the brain develops from the back to the front. The limbic system, which is more that emotional brain, is the one that takes over when it feels like a trauma or a threat is present. The frontal lobe, the learning or thinking part of the brain, the CEO of the brain, sort of shuts down. And what's important to know about that is that early trauma, early in life, creates those myelinized pathways, right? We talk about the importance of strong pathways, but sometimes pathways get made that say this event is traumatic, this event needs this reaction, and that happens over and over. And so what gets strengthened is the part of the brain, again, the brain's trying to be efficient, and it's trying to take out the number of options that are in front of it. And so for young people who experience trauma early on and then experience continued trauma, their brain is learning that I got to respond to this because this is likely to happen again and again. I got to get good at responding to this. And that means what's been strengthened for them is the part of the brain that goes immediately into fight, flight, or freeze, right? So childhood trauma leads to brains that are wired for fear. The brain starts to see everything that is possible as a scary, potentially traumatic opportunity for something bad to happen. And the brain thinks it knows what to do because, again, it's kind of strengthened the pathways to, using things like, emotional decision-making or fight or flight when there isn't really a threat there. So a term that gets used for this often is paper tiger. And there actually is a documentary, which I highly encourage you to consider watching. It is about a school district that shifted from a traditional way of educating to using a trauma-informed approach that really understands how trauma impacts young people. And the name of the documentary is Paper Tigers. And they refer to it in this documentary, and then in many other places you'll hear this term. And what it means is that something that seems as threatening as a tiger is really harmless. It's paper. A paper tiger cannot cause fear or harm, and yet how it is perceived from a brain that has been wired for fear is that that tiger is real. And so this school that really shifted into using a trauma-informed approach, trained their teachers to recognize what was happening in the brains of kids that they'd worked with who had significant trauma histories. So here's what's happening, right? So this is the stress response for many, many people. The doing brain senses danger, right? So the prefrontal cortex part of our brain is like, something's going on. Thinking brain decides it's going to check that out. Okay, like there's maybe some danger. I'm going to figure out what that danger is. If there's no danger, the thinking brain says, don't worry about it. All good. But if there's a sense of danger and the thinking brain checks out the situation and says, yep, there is danger. So now the thinking brain shuts down and it lets the doing brain, or this kind of more primitive brain, do something. And what it's likely to do is one of these three things: fight, flight, or freeze. The body shifts its energy. The brain shifts its energy to respond to that danger or that threat in one of these ways: fight, flight, or freeze. Fight is, again, try to get out there and resolve this, fight back, get through this danger by, being aggressive and powering through. Flight is, I can't fight this. I got to get out of the situation. I got to leave. I got to try to get out of the way because this danger is coming at me. And freeze is, I don't know what to do. Should I fight? Should I flight? Should I leave? Should I go? I'm just going to kind of be paralyzed. Right? And so that's what that very primitive part, the doing part of the brain, the emotion part of the brain, is telling us to do in situations where there is actual danger. And in many cases, this gets many of us out of dangerous situations by using fight, flight, or freeze. But here's what happens for people who have trauma histories, especially when they experience those traumas as during times of brain development. The doing brain senses danger. It never sends that danger signal to the thinking brain. The thinking brain immediately shuts down and acts in that fight, flight, or freeze way, whether the danger is there or not. That is that paper tiger, right? It looks like danger. It looks like a tiger. It must be danger. It must be a tiger, and it actually is not. So behaviorally, what this looks like with the kids that we work with it looks like fighting, right? It looks like fighting over a relatively minor, wouldn't think that this would have such a big response, but because that young person with a trauma history has shifted into their doing brain and they think it's a tiger, they don't see it as a piece of paper that is a paper tiger, they are going to respond with an elevated level of aggression. Someone looks at them funny, someone says something that maybe could be construed as like unkind or disrespectful, and they are in fighting mode right away, right? Maybe they're in the flight mode. So same situation, somebody looks at them funny, there's a relatively minor interaction, and they're like, peace out, I'm gone. And they leave that situation. That's flight, right? That's what that looks like. Sometimes it looks like substance use, right? Like everything around me is heightened in terms of, my cognition is hot. My doing brain is saying there is danger everywhere. I can't turn off my doing brain by myself. I can't talk myself out of this doing brain that is hyper aroused right now. You know what works really well to sort of, numb a hyper aroused brain? Lots of substances, marijuana, alcohol, many of our other illicit drugs that young people that start to use. It is actually a behavioral example of them trying to get away from their doing brain, interacting in fight, flight, or freeze modes, being out of survival mode, because survival mode is great in a crisis, but it's not sustainable, right? Fight, flight, or freeze gets us out of a negative situation. But if everything we see to our left, to our right, in front of us, behind us, around us, all the time is making us fight, flight, or freeze, it's exhausting. And so young people, again, this is not a conscious process, but it is a behavior that we're likely to see is, I don't want to be in this hyper aroused state. Man, getting high now I don't think, now I don't feel. It is the first time in a long time that I have not felt like I needed to use my survival brain to get out of a situation. And then this other one is another interesting way to really understand behaviors from kids with trauma histories. Sometimes they're instigators of chaos. And again, for kids who have trauma histories, chaos is their norm. Their brains know what to do when there's chaos because their survival mode brain, which is on most of the time, it deals with chaos really well. They sort of don't always know what to do when things are calm, and it's really uncomfortable for them when things are calm. And so sometimes they instigate some chaos just so they can feel like now they know what to expect. Now they know what to do. And so what that means, different from some of these other examples, right, where a relatively small, minor thing like someone looking at them funny or saying something that's disrespectful, instead they're the ones looking at somebody funny. They're the ones being disrespectful. They're doing something that then makes that doing brain have a purpose, because now they can fight. Now they can run away. Now they can do all of those things that they are used to doing that have served them well when there was actual danger. And so they kind of create those environments so they know kind of how to be in the world at that time. So that's, again, one of my best understandings of why, why the behaviors that we see with teenagers and young adults who have trauma histories, recognizing that that is, again, tied to that brain development. And they have not had a lot of opportunities for that prefrontal cortex to get strengthened because their experiences weren't around enrichment activities. They weren't around critical thinking and social emotional learning. Their experiences were really around having to survive traumatic things like abuse and neglect, community violence, a wide variety of things that are traumatic that teach that brain that this is the way it is in the world. And so they have the opposite of those highly myelinized neural pathways around language and computer coding. And instead, they've got highly myelinized neural pathways around it's really important to always be able to respond with fight, flight, or freeze. So I'm really sure that I don't want to leave you with that as our last thing to talk about with adolescent brain development. I must leave you with some hope, and there actually is hope here. This is not about a silver lining so much as it is about, now that we know what we know about adolescent brain development, and now that we know what we know about how trauma impacts adolescent brain development, we can react and respond differently. So the concept related to this is called neuroplasticity. And this is the ability of those neural networks in the brain to change. So while we talked about myelinization as that process that strengthens some parts of or some pathways in the brain, and we talked about the pathways that don't get used very often get pruned, it is never fully baked. Even as adults with adult brains, whether we have a trauma history in our or not, we are still, we have the capacity. Our brain has the capacity to change itself. Those changes happen from new abilities, new opportunities, environmental influences, and practice, right? The way to have a strong neural pathway is through practice. So even into adulthood, we can learn new things, we can change the environments that we have around us, and we can practice new skills. And over time, our brain will actually strengthen that pathway instead of the other pathways. And that's true for adults. It's also very true for adolescents, because remember, adolescents are in that phase of brain development where those strong pathways are not fully created. The sooner we can, in our interactions with kids, in our lives, in our schools, in every other professional setting that we're in with them, the sooner we can give them opportunities that are positive, that give them opportunities to practice skills, the more likely it is that they'll be able to have highly myelinized, highly strong pathways for those things. And it will mitigate the impact of strong pathways that have come out of trauma. So how do we do this? How do we help young people's brains actually change and grow? There are lots of ways. One that I like to talk a lot about is this idea of mindfulness, that mindfulness actually helps being present in the moment, putting a pause between a thought and an action, which is one of the things that you can learn to do through a mindfulness practice, actually then decreases the temperature of cognition. So instead of an immediate reaction during hot cognition, being mindful and saying, I feel my body behaving in ways that suggest I'm about to do something in hot cognition. My brain's about to get overheated here. I need to dial that back. Right? Being able to put that pause in there between the emotion and the action and put that thinking in between. So now that we're seeing ETA thinking instead of EAT thinking and doing, lots and lots of opportunities to do this with young people. Meditation is a particular type of mindful practice that has lots of great research on its impact in the brain, that it actually, again, kind of creates opportunities for the brain to settle and be calm and be present in this moment. It can reduce blood pressure, which is one of the physical reactions that a hot cognition brain is actually creating in the body, is this heightened arousal state, which often is this increased kind of blood pressure and increased, attention in our bodies, energy in our bodies. Meditation can help calm that, can reduce that blood pressure, can reduce that kind of kinetic and frenetic energy. And this can be taught to young people. We are seeing more and more yoga in schools, meditation, mindfulness programs in schools, and that little kiddos, long before they are teenagers, can learn to do some deep belly breathing. They can learn to put a pause between an emotion and an action. And again, the earlier we teach this and the more consistently we apply this, the better. But even if you're working with teens who haven't had access to mindfulness in schools, all is not lost. At any point along the way, there are opportunities for young people to learn mindful practices. And again, they don't need to be super costly. They don't need to be these really long and drawn out 45 minutes of silent sits a day. We've got evidence that says in 8 weeks, just 15 minutes a day of mindful practice can change the gray matter in the brain. We can start changing those neural pathways within 2 months of time of consistent practice. That just begins that change, though. We know that for a habit to be built, it's going to take much more time than that. But within 8 weeks, we can start to see those changes in the brain. So all is absolutely not lost. I hope that I am leaving you again with a really good understanding of what's happening in the brain, understanding why kids may be doing what they're doing, and some ideas for how you can then, react and act and introduce different ways of being and interacting with young people. So I'm going to stop my formal presentation here and open it up to questions. I've seen some things popping up in the chat, so I know Janet and Cynthia will probably help us guide this next bit of time.
Thank you, Lorian, for a wonderful, insightful presentation. Actually, I could go all the way through this with you one more time without stopping. So one of many of the questions that the chat asked, you covered like traumatic childhood, mindfulness, you introduced tools. I do have a question for you related to, you focused in on one of the questions that I think was very insightful regarding what were you thinking. Is there another question that's top of mind that you would ask adults to consider not asking an adult? I mean, not asking an adolescent. You're on mute.
There we go. Muted there. So not saying, what were you thinking? I might encourage them to ask if they, say to a teenager who's, done something that is, that they've said they weren't ever going to do and now they do it. A response to that might be, how did that work out for you? What do you think you might do differently in the future? That asking them to be future oriented, but, saying like, what happened and what was the result? And what do you think about that result? Like, can you live with the consequence of that decision you made? And if not, what do you think you want to do differently in the future? What might you do the next time that this situation presents itself? The next time you could drink, what might you do? Would you do the same thing or do something different? What might you do the next time there was an opportunity to engage, in an aggressive way? Did you like the consequence that happened this time? Would you want that to happen again? So I would explore a little bit further how, let them see consequences of action, talk with them about if that consequence is something they want to have happen again or not. What do you think you might do differently next time? And then here's a really important question. How can I help you? What would be helpful for me as your parent, as your social worker, as your teacher, as, whatever that role in, what could I do to help you if you want something to happen differently next time? What could we do? And sometimes they'll say, I don't know, right? And so sometimes it's, would it be helpful to practice this? Because, this is not the only time somebody's going to look at you funny. So would it be helpful to practice in our, in our sessions together or over family dinner, right? Whatever that time might be with kids, to say, like, let's practice this. The more opportunities to practice it in cold cognition, the more opportunities the brain has to build those strong pathways, so that the next time, and again, it isn't a guarantee that the next time they won't get into a fight, but man, maybe it'll take them 5 minutes longer to get into that fight than it did the last time, because they're trying something new in those 5 minutes. And again, that thing that they're trying that's new, they haven't exercised that muscle enough. So then they default to something that is that emotional brain, but they've put a 5 minute, they've lasted 5 minutes longer. And so then the conversation with them after that is, what allowed you to go 5 extra minutes before your brain kind of kicked into emotion mode? Like, what could we do to help you go 10 minutes before your brain starts to kick into emotion mode?
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Super helpful. So we have several questions around meditation and mindfulness. I'm going to try to conflate a couple of questions together. People wondering about your favorite resources for teens and mindfulness meditation, and then also specifically any tips that you have for a teen that, let's say the adult thinks this is going to be super helpful and the teen is resistant, and ultimately you got to get that buy-in to change the behavior.
Yeah. So I'll start with my favorite resources for mindfulness. So I have a very, very robust mindfulness practice. I actually today hit 2,230 consecutive days of meditation, and I'm over 3,000 total days since 2013. So I have not missed a day of meditation since August of 2015. So I use a lot of resources that really have grounded me in this practice. My favorite is Insight Timer. And what I love about that is, number one, it's free. And there are literally tens of thousands of meditations and mindful activities in that app that are available for free. There is a pay option if you want to do a course, if you want to do a 10-day or a longer course in mindfulness practices, but I don't think any of that is necessary. I've never paid for a meditation through Insight Timer in all of those years. It has a timer function, which is sometimes helpful if a kid's like, I don't want to do meditation. Meditation is too woo-woo, it's too out there, it's not for me. A timer is nothing more than we set timers for all kinds of things. So set a timer for 10 minutes and just sit. You don't have to close your eyes. You don't have to breathe deeply. You just got to sit. And you can use the Insight Timer app to set a timer for 10 minutes. It can come with ambient sound. It can come with no sound. It'll come with bells every 3 minutes or no bells at all. All kinds of options there, especially if what you're getting is this resistance to a guided meditation, because, again, some people like that and some people don't. There are mindful meditation options in that specifically for children and for teenagers. You can sort and search for those. And what I would say is like, you might try one, a teenager might try one and be like, I don't like this, turn it off and find another one, right? There's nothing to say that you have to sit through a 10-minute mindfulness activity just because you started it that day because you liked the title and it said mindfulness for teens and you listen to it and you're like, I don't like this. So I think giving kids that freedom to say, this isn't really working for me. So let's try something else, right? Let's find one. Maybe the guided ones don't work. Maybe it's helpful to just do a 10-minute sit, a quiet sit. Don't even have to deep breathe, just sit quietly for 10 minutes, see where your brain takes you, see where, see what happens when your brain can kind of settle. So those would be my favorite resources. And again, for kids who say this won't work, again, what I would say is, man, it's a good thing there are lots of options out there, right? So this didn't work. What else might we try? What are some of those other options that, if you don't like a guided meditation, you don't like, somebody telling you to breathe, what could we do instead? Was there anything about it that you found useful, right? And again, concrete thinkers are very all or nothing. They either love it or they hate it, and there isn't a lot of in between. But if part of what we're doing in our, kind of helping young people start to develop that abstract thinking in that prefrontal cortex is there are some shades there. It might not be perfect, but would you try it again is different from I hated it and I loved it. They could be something in between there. And what in later adolescence and into adulthood, we're much better at seeing kind of the continuum and the spectrum of things. And so helping teenagers realize, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can be somewhere in between.
Do you have any tips, Lorian, for the technology addicted adolescent?
Yeah, man. So I think all adolescents are likely technology addicted. They're digital natives, right? So they don't see that as an addiction. It is their way of life. It is how they interact. It is how they respond. It is how they, it is their world. And it's even more their world because of remote learning or, even the shift into in-person learning, but they all have their own Chromebooks, right? So as opposed to us saying this is a technology addiction, it's saying like, how are teens using technology and what is the impact of all of this use of technology? So recognizing that technology is technology doesn't necessarily good or bad. It can be used in ways that are negative. It can be used to circumvent other interactions face to face, but it also can be used in really positive ways. It can create opportunities when face to face can't happen, right? So seeing technology as technology. And what I don't have is a lot of research yet on how technology might be impacting the adolescent brain. If that's sort of where that question was coming from, I think that's like, it's in my mind always that like, I would really love to see how technology is impacting brains. And I don't have that research yet, but it's something I'll definitely continue to look for. Maybe I'll do another open classroom just on the role of technology with adolescent brain development.
Well, we would love to take you up on that if you do, because I think particularly in this time of the pandemic where limits on technology and screen time have been out the window in so many households, lots of us are wondering what are the impacts and what are the mitigators. Another research question from Kelly. She's curious if you know any research around the effectiveness of sort of just say no messaging related to substance abuse. Anything on that you want to comment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know just say no doesn't work. These information only programs that have kind of scare tactics built into them are not that effective. What does really work, again, is things that really do strengthen those neural pathways for teens, opportunities to practice skills. That's what we know works in substance use prevention and in lots of other risky behavior prevention as well. If we want young people to have positive interactions and communications with their peers, if we want them to delay risky sexual behaviors, all of those things come with opportunities to practice skills, not just to be scared, right? Because the scare tactics, again, because kids are, especially kids in egocentric thinking, they don't think that will happen to them. You can show them pictures of people with scarred lungs all day long. They do not believe they will have scarred lungs from vaping. So instead of trying to convince them that they will, it's an opportunity to say, there are lots of consequences of vaping. Some we know and some we don't. Some happen a whole lot sooner than others. And I want you to be able to make an informed decision. So where could you go to find out information about the harmful effects of vaping? Then you go do that work, right? So you're empowering them to learn some information on their own. That is how, again, that's as close as you can get to you telling them, is have them look at it, right? I'm not saying you can't vape. I'm saying before you think about vaping, let's figure out, is it really that risky? I may not know. I'd love for you to help me figure that out. And then we can sit down together and talk about whether or not that's something, those consequences of vaping are something that you're willing to live with, because ultimately you got to live with them, right?
Very helpful response. So Diane is mentioning that she recently attended a webinar and learned about the role of music in developing frontal cortex and addressing, or at least contributing to addressing trauma. I was curious if there was anything more that you wanted to say. I was struck, all these wonderful things that we can do that help stimulate myelinization, and many of them are things that privileged young people have great access to, and the less privileged, the higher the risk, the less art lessons, drama, music, going to the orchestra, traveling abroad, all of these wonderful things. I just wanted to clear a little bit of floor space for if people are trying to help a child in a lower resource setting and money or parental access is a challenge, what can we do when resources are challenged?
Absolutely. So yeah, so I love that that other folks are experiencing some of the concepts that I've talked about here, showing up in other webinars or other Prof Dev sessions they're going to. And so I think this doesn't have to be huge ways. I think always we should be advocates in the systems in which we work, that our systems should be developmentally appropriate for teenagers. And that means developmentally appropriate for their brain development, which means access to as many of those things as possible. So that is one thing that we should be doing at all times. And there are little ways that we can do this as well, right? We can build in music to our individual sessions with kids. Everybody can stream something. You can stream it from your phone. They can probably stream it from 6 different devices. Music in that way can be part of our individual experience, right? Art can be used in similar ways. Expressive therapies can be used in one-on-one settings, even if there isn't full access to that everywhere that we are. So I think it's a both and of advocating for that to be present in our settings and in our systems, and recognizing how in little ways, the things that we have control over, like how we spend our time with teenagers, what our office looks like. Our office can be full of, things that are stimulating to their senses, stimulating to their thought processes. We have control over that, and we should use that. We should use everything that we know about what helps build adolescent brains into those strong, healthy brains in the little ways, and in such a way that we're actually modeling for our colleagues how possible this is without an overhaul of some big system.
That's super encouraging. So we are nearing time, and there are some very kind comments from the audience thanking you for a really informative session. I'm going to give you one last question and then hopefully a chance to give a final thought. So we've talked about this in broad strokes, and I'm curious, sort of in the moment, if you're a parent, a teacher, and you're, working with a young person, how would you encourage people to think about consequences versus punishment versus supporting? Because as the sort of responsible adult, all of those things come into play, and I just like to invite a little more comment from you on how to think about those things.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, best practices in working with adolescents and raising adolescents is involve them as much as possible, right? Have consequences be natural consequences when you can, meaning, that you don't take away something arbitrary, but that there's a natural consequence. If the behavior was, drinking and driving, then they lose their car because they can't be, they're not using that in an appropriate way, right? So think about natural consequences and having teenagers weigh in on what is reasonable, what is feasible, because when we don't, we end up doing, we kind of overthink, right? You're grounded until you're dead, or you've lost your phone forever. They know we don't mean that, so we should say what we mean, right? And that we have conversations in advance when they're in cold cognition about, here are the expectations, here are the rules. What should, are these rules, can you live with them, right? You don't have to like it, but can you live with them? And here are some consequences. Which of these do you think we should use? And then when you implement that consequence and they're, complaining about it, it's, man, you're right, this does really stink, but this was one of the things we talked about in advance. And always saying, let's have a better day tomorrow. Let's try this again. The opportunity for redemption is huge and very necessary for kids. The opportunity to recover and start with a clean slate as soon as possible, it keeps us in relationship with kids, and it keeps us, giving them opportunities to try again and to do better and to do differently in the future. So we always want to make sure that our punishments or our consequences are not so long lasting that they lose that opportunity to recover quickly and try again and show us better, right?
Super important for all of us, actually, to have a bad day and then a better one tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are at time, and so much wisdom already shared, but Lorian, is there a final thought, call to action, or key message that you want to leave this group with?
Yeah, so these resources that I've listed here on this slide are available, or they soon will be available in Open Classroom. There are some good additional tips there. A lot of the information that I gathered throughout the day is from these sources. And I would just say, thank you for caring enough about the teenagers in your world to sit either live with us today or in front of a computer or YouTube link in the future, to want to know about adolescent brain development and to want to try things differently. So my closing thought is a thank you. This is hard work. Teenagers are hard, and what they're doing makes developmental sense. It doesn't mean it makes it easier day to day, but thank you for wanting to engage with this, and thank you for taking it to the next step with the teenagers in your lives.
Well, Lorian, thank you for taking the time to curate all of this and share your wisdom with us. A wonderful audience, grateful for all of your questions and resources that you shared with each other. Cynthia, thank you so much for always having my back as a great co-host. And with that, we're going to call this a day. Hope to see everybody back at another Open Classroom very soon. Please stay healthy and safe out there, everyone. And please keep doing that good work with teens. Bye.
Okay, everybody.